Good evening, and welcome to Slumber Scrolls. Tonight, we venture into the realm of gods and thunder, into stories older than memory itself, to explore the life of the most powerful deity the ancient Greeks ever knew. Please like and subscribe before the journey commences. Before we begin, it's worth noting that Greek mythology doesn't have a single, definitive version. These stories come to us from many ancient sources: poets like Hesiod and Homer, playwrights like Aeschylus and Euripides, historians and mythographers writing centuries apart. Sometimes these sources agree, sometimes they contradict each other, and sometimes they offer fascinating variations on the same tale. Where the stories diverge, we'll explore the most widely accepted versions while acknowledging when other tellings exist. Get comfortable, settle in, and let us begin our journey through the complete mythic life of Zeus, the king of Olympus. The world before Zeus. Before we can understand Zeus, we must first understand the world he was born into, a world ruled not by the Olympian gods we know so well, but by older powers, forces more elemental and more terrible in their grandeur. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not the chaos of disorder that we think of today, but something far more ancient and profound. Chaos was a yawning void, an emptiness so vast and so complete that it existed before existence itself had meaning. From this primordial nothingness came the first stirrings of being. Gaia emerged, the earth herself, solid and eternal. Tartarus formed in the depths below, a place of darkness and dread. And Eros appeared, not as the playful cherub of later tales, but as a fundamental force, the power of attraction and creation that would bind the cosmos together. From the union of night and darkness came other forces. Ether, the pure upper air that would one day be breathed by gods. Hera, the day, who would chase her mother night across the sky in an endless cycle. These were not gods as we might imagine them, not beings with personalities and desires, but rather cosmic principles given form, the building blocks of reality itself. Gaia, patient and fertile, brought forth Uranus, the starry sky. He was both her son and her consort, and when he stretched himself across her, arching from horizon to horizon, the world found its first true shape. Together, earth and sky created the Titans, 12 mighty beings who would be the first generation of gods as the Greeks understood them. There was Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world. Hyperion, lord of light. Zeus, the inquiring mind. Cronus, who marked the constellations. Iapetus, who would become the ancestor of humankind. And Cronus, the youngest and most cunning of them all. Among the daughters of Gaia and Uranus were Thea, who would give birth to the sun and moon. Rhea, who would become the mother of gods. Themis, the living embodiment of divine law. Mnemosyne, who was memory itself. Phoebe, the radiant one. And Tethys, whose waters nourished all life. But Gaia's womb did not only produce these magnificent beings. She also bore children of terrible aspect and immense power. First came the Cyclopes, 3 brothers each with a single eye burning in the center of their massive foreheads. Their names were Brontes, Steropes, and Argesh, and they possessed skills in craftsmanship that would one day forge weapons capable of shaking the very foundations of the universe. They were giants of incredible strength, simple in their ways but fearless in their hearts. Then came the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones. There were 3 of them as well, and each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms. When these beings moved, the earth trembled. When they grew angry, mountains could be torn from their roots. They were monstrous to behold, their very existence a testament to the wild, untamed creativity of primordial nature. Uranus, though he was lord of the sky and consort to the great earth herself, looked upon these monstrous children with fear and revulsion. He could not bear to see them, could not tolerate the thought that such grotesque beings had come from his union with Gaia. And so, in an act of cruelty that would echo through generations, He seized the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires and forced them back into Gaia's womb, sealing them in the deepest places of the earth where no light could reach them and no voice could call for their release. Gaia groaned beneath the weight of these imprisoned children. The earth herself suffered with every breath, her pain growing deeper and more unbearable with each passing age. She had given birth to wonders and terrors alike, and her consort had met her gift with shame and violence. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound, and in her suffering, Gaia began to plot. But the seeds she planted would take time to bear fruit, and the cosmos would have to wait for justice. For now, the Titans ruled. They strode across the young earth, each claiming dominion over their own sphere of influence. They married amongst themselves, creating unions that would produce the next generation of divine beings. It was an age of raw power, of beings whose very natures were tied to the fundamental forces of existence. But it was also an age that carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, for the wound that Uranus had inflicted upon Gaia had not healed, and the debt he owed would eventually come due. The world in this early age was strange and primal. There were no mortals yet to witness the grandeur and terror of the Titans. The earth was young, its mountains still rising, its seas still finding their boundaries. The sky stretched vast and unknowable overhead, and beneath the ground, in places sealed away from light and life, the imprisoned children of Gaia waited in darkness, their strength growing, their patience wearing thin. This was the world that existed before. Zeus, a world of elemental forces and cosmic powers, a world where the bonds of family were as strong as creation itself and as fragile as a whisper. It was into this world of titans and tensions that Zeus would be born, though his birth lay many ages in the future, and before he could take his place, the old order would have to fall. The cruelty of Cronus and the prophecy, Uranus's tyranny over his children, could not last forever. Gaia, suffering beneath the weight of her imprisoned offspring and seething with rage at her consort's cruelty, fashioned a weapon from her own substance. She created a great sickle of unyielding flint, jagged and sharp as truth itself, and she brought it before her Titan children. "Who among you will help me?" she asked. "Who will stand against your father and free your brothers from their prison?" One by one, the Titans turned away. Even these mighty beings, gods in their own right, feared the power of their father Uranus. The sky was vast, and his authority seemed absolute. None wished to raise their hand against the one who had given them life. All except Cronus. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, stepped forward. There was something in his eyes, a gleam of ambition perhaps, or maybe just a calculation of opportunity. He took the sickle from his mother's hands and waited for his moment. That moment came when Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, as he did in the eternal cycle of day and night. As the sky pressed down upon the earth, Cronus struck. The sickle cut true and deep, severing Uranus from his power in one swift, terrible motion. The sky god's cry shook the cosmos, a sound of rage and pain and betrayal that echoed from one end of creation to the other. Cronus cast the severed flesh into the sea, and where it fell, the waters began to foam and churn. From that white froth, something new was born. Aphrodite emerged from the waves, impossibly beautiful, a goddess whose very presence would inspire desire and madness in equal measure. She stepped ashore at Cyprus, untouched by the violence of her creation, serene and terrible in her perfection. But the blood that fell upon the earth brought forth other beings as well. Where drops struck the ground, the Furies sprang to life, cloaked in shadow and ancient rage. These beings would become the hunters of oath-breakers and the tormentors of those who committed crimes against family. They were relentless and merciless, born from violence to punish violence. The giants also emerged from that spilled blood, massive beings who would one day rise up in their own rebellion against the gods. And the Melii, nymphs of the ash trees, guardians of wild places and old ways. Uranus, wounded and dethroned, retreated into the farthest reaches of the sky. But before he vanished from the affairs of the world, he spoke a curse, and it was a curse born not of invention but of truth. "Just as I have been overthrown by my son," he said, "so too shall you be overthrown by yours." The words hung in the air like a dark prophecy, because that is exactly what they were. Cronus heard them, and he knew in that moment that his victory was incomplete. He had won the throne of the cosmos, had become king of the Titans and ruler of all that existed. But the shadow of his father's curse would follow him, growing longer and darker with each passing age. For a time, Cronus ruled well. This was the age that later generations would remember as a golden time, when the earth was bountiful and the seasons gentle. Mortals had begun to appear in this age, and they lived without toil or war, the fruits of the earth ripening without need for cultivation. Justice moved unseen among humanity, and there was peace across the wide world. Cronus took Rhea as his wife, his own sister, as was the way among the Titans. Together they ruled from their seat of power atop Mount Olympus in the south. Rhea was a Titaness of great wisdom and gentle strength, and for a while their union seemed blessed. But the curse of Uranus hung over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. When Rhea bore her first child, a daughter named Hestia, Cronus felt the first stirrings of the fear that would come to define him. He remembered his father's words. He thought of his own rebellion, his own act of violence against the one who had given him life, and he made a terrible decision. The moment Hestia was placed in his arms, Cronus opened his jaws wide and swallowed her whole. Rhea watched in horror as her newborn daughter disappeared down her husband's throat. She pleaded with him, begged him to reconsider, but Cronus was unmoved. He would not suffer the same fate as his father, he told her. The throne must be protected. The prophecy must be prevented, no matter the cost. And so, when Rhea bore her second child, a daughter called Demeter, the same terrible scene repeated itself. Cronus swallowed the infant, and Demeter joined her sister in the dark prison of their father's belly. A third daughter came, Hera, proud and beautiful even as a newborn. She too was swallowed. A fourth child, a son this time, named Hades. He lasted only moments in the world before Cronus devoured him. A fifth child, another son, Poseidon. The same fate befell him. 5 times Rhea gave birth. 5 times she watched her husband steal her children from her arms and imprison them in darkness. The pain of it was unbearable, a wound that cut deeper than any blade. She had given life to these beings, had nurtured them in her womb, and within moments of their birth they were taken from her, hidden away in a place where her love could not reach them. But Rhea was not without her own cunning, and she had learned much from watching the cycles of betrayal and revenge that defined her family. When she felt the stirring of a 6th child in her womb, she knew that this time would be different. This child would not be swallowed. This child would be her vengeance and her salvation. She went in secret to her mother Gaia, and together they devised a plan. When the time came for the birth, Rhea did not go to Cronus. Instead, she fled to the island of Crete, to a place called Mount Ida, where the mountains rose tall and the caves ran deep beneath the earth. There, hidden from her husband's sight, she gave birth to her 6th child. It was a son, and from the moment of his first breath, Rhea knew he was different. His cry shook the trees. His eyes opened before his first moments had passed. When he grasped his mother's finger, he held it with a strength that seemed to contain the weight of destiny itself. She named him Zeus. The hidden years. Zeus in Crete, the infant Zeus, could not remain with his mother. Cronus would eventually notice her absence and come searching. The deception had to be complete, the illusion perfect. And so, with a breaking heart, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, making it roughly the size and shape of a newborn child. She carried this false infant back to Cronus and placed it in his arms. Cronus, so consumed by his fear and paranoia that he had grown careless, swallowed the stone without question. It settled heavy in his belly alongside his other children, and he believed the threat had been dealt with once more. He did not notice the difference. He did not see through the ruse. He returned to his throne, secure in the belief that the prophecy had been thwarted once again. But far away on Crete, in a cave whose exact location the ancient sources debate, some placing it on Mount Dicte, others on the slopes of Mount Ida, the true sixth child of Cronus and Rhea lay cradled in safety. The cave that would become Zeus's nursery was no ordinary place. It was a sacred space, a place where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that something momentous was taking place within its depths. Rhea could not stay to raise her son, for her absence would eventually be noticed and questions would be asked. Instead, she entrusted Zeus to guardians who would keep him safe and help him grow strong. The divine goat Amalthea became his nurse, and the young god drank her milk, which was more than simple sustenance. It was divine nourishment, imbued with strength and power that would serve Zeus all his days. The cave echoed with the sounds of the infant god, his cries and his laughter, his first words and his growing strength. But these sounds could not be allowed to carry beyond the hidden place, lest they reach the ears of his father. And so, the Curetes came to guard him. These were warriors, young and fierce, and they danced outside the cave with their weapons and their shields. They clashed their spears against their armor, creating a tremendous din that drowned out any sound Zeus might make. They sang loud songs and beat drums, turning the mountainside into a constant celebration that masked the presence of the hidden child. There are stories that say other divine beings helped to raise Zeus in those early years. The nymphs of the mountain, the Melee born from the blood of Uranus, brought him honey so sweet it seemed to contain the essence of the earth itself. The bees of Crete, sacred and ancient, shared their golden treasure with the infant god. Some tales speak of Melissa, a nymph whose name meant bee, who discovered the use of honey and shared it first with a child who would become king of the gods. Zeus grew in that cave, sheltered from the world and from his father's terrible hunger. But he did not grow in ignorance. The stories say that Gaia herself visited the cave, whispering to her grandson of the history of the world, of the crimes committed against her and against justice itself. She told him of his imprisoned uncles, the Cyclopes and the Hecatonkaias, still suffering in the depths of the earth. She spoke of his siblings, alive but trapped in the darkness of their father's belly, waiting for liberation that might never come. As Zeus grew from infant to child and from child to youth, his strength began to manifest. The milk of Amalthea had given him more than normal sustenance. He grew larger and stronger than any ordinary being. His eyes held a keen intelligence that seemed to pierce through surface appearances to the truth beneath. When he moved, there was a grace and power in his limbs that spoke of his divine nature. The young god learned the ways of the mountain. He climbed the slopes of Ida, growing familiar with every crag and valley. He watched the eagles soar overhead and studied their flight, their freedom and their mastery of the sky. He observed the storms that rolled in from the sea, the way lightning split the heavens and thunder shook the earth. He was learning, even in these hidden years, what it meant to command the forces of nature. As Zeus reached adulthood, the truth of his nature and his destiny became impossible to ignore. He was not meant to remain hidden forever. The prophecy that Cronus feared was not a thing that could be prevented by swallowing children or hiding away from the consequences of past actions. It was woven into the fabric of fate itself, and the time for its fulfillment was drawing near. Gaia came to Zeus again, but this time her message was different. It was time, she told him, time to leave the cave, time to face his father, time to free his siblings and overthrow the king who had ruled through fear and violence. The world was waiting for a new order, for a justice that went beyond the simple cycle of violence begetting violence. And Zeus, raised in secret but destined for greatness, was the one who would bring that new order into being. But first, he would need help. Cronus was no weak opponent. He was a Titan, one of the first gods, and his power was immense. Zeus could not simply march up to Mount Olympus and demand the throne. He would need allies, weapons, and above all, he would need wisdom. And so, before he left his hidden sanctuary, Zeus sought out Metis. Metis was an Oceanid, a Titaness whose domain was cunning intelligence and wise counsel. Her name itself meant wisdom, and she possessed a kind of strategic brilliance that could turn disadvantage into victory. When Zeus came to her and explained his situation, Metis listened carefully, and together they began to craft a plan that would change the cosmos forever. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Zeus could not defeat Cronus through strength alone, not yet, but he could defeat him through deception, through turning the Titan's own actions against him. Metis prepared a special mixture, a powerful emetic that would cause Cronus to regurgitate everything he had swallowed. It would be bitter and strong, and it would need to be administered secretly, perhaps disguised as wine or some other drink. Zeus took the potion that Metis had prepared, and he left the cave on Mount Ida for the first time in his life. He was no longer a hidden child or a secret hope. He was a young god, strong and determined, and he was going to war. His war would not begin with thunder and lightning, though those would come in time. It would begin with a cup of wine and a father who had forgotten that the most dangerous enemies are often those we have wronged. The stone and the siblings. The first victory Zeus's approach to his father's court required careful planning. He could not arrive as a challenger, not at first. The deception had to be maintained long enough for the plan to work. Some stories say that Zeus disguised himself, taking on a form that would not immediately reveal his true identity. Others suggest that he came as a cupbearer, a servant offering refreshment to the king of the Titans. However he managed it, Zeus found himself in his father's presence, and he carried with him the potion that Metis had crafted. Cronus, secure in his power and confident that his precautions had been successful, accepted the drink. Perhaps it was wine mixed with the potion. Perhaps it was nectar, the drink of the gods, laced with Metis's powerful compound. Whatever form it took, Cronus consumed it, and almost immediately its effects began to manifest. The Titan king felt a churning in his gut, a terrible nausea that grew stronger with each passing moment. His body rebelled against him, and he was powerless to stop what came next. With a groan and a convulsion, Cronus began to vomit forth the children he had swallowed. First came the stone, the false Zeus wrapped in swaddling clothes, still intact after all these years in the darkness. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud, and Cronus stared at it in confusion and dawning horror. But the stone was only the beginning. Poseidon emerged next, no longer an infant but fully grown, strong and fierce, his eyes blazing with anger at his long imprisonment. Then came Hades, dark and grim, his time in the belly of his father having left him changed, more comfortable with darkness and shadow than with light. Hera followed, regal and proud despite her ordeal, her bearing that of a queen even in her first moments of freedom. Demeter came forth, bringing with her an aura of growing things, of seasons and harvests. And finally, Hestia, the eldest, gentle and serene, the first to be swallowed and now the last to be freed. The 6 children of Cronus and Rhea stood together for the first time, and the sight of them assembled was enough to make the Titan king realize the magnitude of his mistake. They were gods in their own right, not diminished by their imprisonment, but perhaps made stronger by it. They had lived in darkness, but they had not been broken by it. And now they stood before their father, and in their eyes was not forgiveness but judgment. Zeus stepped forward, revealing himself for who he truly was. "I am the sixth child," he said. "I am the one you thought you had swallowed. The prophecy you feared has come to pass, Father, not because it could be prevented, but because you tried to prevent it. Your fear has brought about the very thing you most dreaded." The confrontation that followed was brief, but charged with the weight of cosmic significance. Cronus understood in that moment that his reign was over, but understanding did not mean acceptance. He would not surrender the throne willingly. If his children wanted his power, they would have to take it by force. And so began the war that would reshape the cosmos. But before the fighting could truly commence, Zeus knew that he and his siblings would need more than their own strength. They would need the kind of power that only the most ancient and terrible beings could provide. They would need to descend into places that even the gods feared to tread. Zeus gathered his siblings and shared with them what Gaia had told him during his years in the cave. There were others imprisoned by Cronus, others who had suffered under his rule. The Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, locked away in the depths of Tartarus, guarded by the monster camp who had been placed there specifically to ensure they never escaped. If these beings could be freed, if they could be convinced to join the cause against Cronus, then perhaps victory would be possible. The journey to Tartarus was not undertaken lightly. This was the deepest place in all of creation, a realm of shadow and suffering that lay beneath even the underworld itself. The path down was treacherous, and the darkness was absolute. But Zeus led his siblings into those depths, driven by the knowledge that without these allies, the war against the Titans would be lost before it truly began. They found the imprisoned brothers in the lowest pits of Tartarus, in a place where no light had ever reached. The Cyclopes were there, their single eyes dim from ages spent in darkness. The Hecatonchires were there as well, their 100 hands bound, their 50 heads bowed in despair. And standing guard over them was Camp, a monstrous creature of terrible aspect, half woman and half serpent, with wings and claws and a hunger for violence. Zeus faced Camp without hesitation. The battle between the young god and the ancient monster shook the foundations of Tartarus itself. Zeus fought with a ferocity born of righteous anger, and he struck Camp down, slaying the guardian and freeing the prisoners she had been set to watch. The Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires emerged from their prison, blinking in what little light existed in those depths. They looked upon Zeus and his siblings with suspicion at first. Why should they trust these Olympians? Why should they believe that this new generation would be any different from the old? But Zeus spoke to them with honesty and passion. He told them of the injustice that Cronus had perpetrated, not only against them but against his own children. He promised that if they would fight alongside the Olympians, they would never again be imprisoned. They would be honored and free to live as they chose. The time had come for a new order, an order based not on fear and oppression, but on justice and mutual respect. The Cyclopes listened, and in Zeus they saw something different from the Titans who had imprisoned them. They saw a leader worth following, and so they agreed to join the war against Cronus. More than that, they offered to craft weapons for the Olympians, weapons that would tip the balance of power in the coming conflict. In the forges of the deep earth, in a place where the heart of the world still burned hot, the Cyclopes worked their craft. For Zeus, they forged thunderbolts, jagged spears of lightning that could split mountains and shake the heavens. These were not simple tools, but extensions of Zeus's will, weapons that responded to his command and channeled the raw power of the storm itself. For Poseidon, they created a trident, a 3-pronged spear that would give him dominion over the seas, allowing him to create earthquakes and command the waves. For Hades, they fashioned a helm of invisibility, a dark crown that would make its wearer unseen, able to move through the world like a shadow. Armed with these weapons, and with the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires as their allies, the Olympian gods prepared for war. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the fate of the cosmos. On one side stood Cronus and the Titans, the old order, rulers of the world since the fall of Uranus. On the other stood Zeus and his siblings, along with their monstrous but powerful allies, representing a new vision for how the universe should be governed. The war would be called the Titanomachy, and it would rage for 10 years, scarring the earth and shaking the heavens. But in this moment, standing in the depths of Tartarus with his weapons newly forged and his allies assembled, Zeus must have felt the first stirring of certainty. The prophecy was not just being fulfilled, it was being transformed. This would not be a simple repetition of the pattern that had come before. This would be something new, something better. Or so he hoped. The Titanomachy, 10 years of divine war. When the Olympians emerged from Tartarus, they made their way to Mount Olympus in the north, the highest peak in all of Greece. It was there that they established their base, claiming the mountain as their own and fortifying it against the inevitable response from the Titans. Olympus stood tall and proud, its summit often wreathed in clouds, a natural fortress that would serve as the seat of the new gods. Word of Zeus's rebellion spread quickly through the divine realm. Cronus, recovering from the shock of having his children literally torn from his belly, gathered his allies. Most of the Titans rallied to him, their loyalty bound by kinship and by the familiar order he represented. But not all Titans chose to fight for Cronus. Themis, Titaness of divine law and natural order, looked upon the conflict and saw in Zeus a greater claim to justice. She sided with the Olympians. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, could see how the war would end, and he chose to fight for the future rather than the past. His brother Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, followed his lead. The majority of the Titans, however, stood with Cronus. Oceanus, the ancient river that circled the world, remained neutral, too old and too wise to engage in what he perhaps saw as a family squabble that would resolve itself in time. But the others took up arms. Hyperion, lord of light, blazed with fury. Iapetus and his sons, particularly the mighty Atlas, became the backbone of the Titan army. Zeus, Crius, and the other male Titans prepared for battle, establishing their stronghold on Mount Olympus in the south, opposite to the Olympian position on Olympus in the north. The first clashes of the Titanomachy were apocalyptic in their violence. These were not mortal armies fighting with swords and spears, though those weapons were certainly present. This was a war of gods, and every blow struck had the power to reshape the landscape. When Zeus hurled his thunderbolts, mountains were split open and forests caught fire. When Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, the ground itself shook and tsunamis rose from the sea. The Titans responded with their own terrible powers, and the world became a battleground of cosmic forces. The mortal inhabitants of the earth, still few in number in this early age, could only watch in terror as the sky above them turned into a battlefield. Lightning split the heavens continuously, not in brief flashes, but in sustained barrages that turned night into day. Thunder rolled constantly, a never-ending drum that shook the bones of the earth. The seas rose and fell wildly, swallowing islands and creating new ones with each passing day. Volcanoes erupted, spewing fire and ash into the air until the sun was hidden behind dark clouds. For 10 years, this war raged without pause. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The Titans were powerful and experienced, and they fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat would mean the end of their dominion. The Olympians were younger but no less fierce, and they fought with the conviction that they were bringing necessary change to a corrupt order. The battles were not just fought on the slopes of mountains or in the valleys between them. The gods clashed in the skies, meeting in mid-air to exchange blows that created storms. They fought beneath the sea, where Poseidon's power gave the Olympians an advantage, but where the sheer might of the Titans could still turn the tide. They even fought in the hidden places of the earth, in caverns and passages where the darkness was lit only by the flash of divine power. Zeus proved himself to be not just a powerful warrior, but a skilled commander. He coordinated his forces, using Hades' invisibility to launch surprise attacks, and positioning Poseidon where his control over water and earth could do the most damage. He led from the front when necessary, but was also willing to step back and let his siblings take the lead when their particular abilities would serve better. The Hecatonkaias, the hundred-handed giants, became weapons of mass destruction in their own right. When they entered a battle, they would tear boulders from mountains and hurl them at the Titans, their 100 hands working in concert to create a continuous barrage that was nearly impossible to defend against. The Cyclopes, when they weren't crafting and maintaining the divine weapons, fought alongside the Olympians with the ferocity of beings who had been wrongly imprisoned and were now taking their revenge. The female Titans, for the most part, did not participate directly in the fighting. This wasn't from any weakness on their part, but rather from a recognition that the conflict was primarily about succession and power, issues that concerned the male gods more directly. Some of them, like Rhea, supported the Olympians quietly, offering counsel and assistance where they could. Others remained neutral, waiting to see how the cosmic dice would fall before committing to either side. As the war dragged on, the landscape of the world was transformed. Mountains that had stood since the earth was young were leveled. New ranges were thrown up by the violence of divine combat. Rivers changed their courses. Coastlines were redrawn. The earth itself bore the scars of this conflict, marks that would remain for ages to come as testament to the fury of warring gods. The turning point in the war came when Zeus made a strategic decision that would prove decisive. He called upon the Hecatonkaias to focus their assault on Mount Olympus itself, the stronghold of the Titans. The hundred-handed giants positioned themselves around the mountain and began to hurl boulders at it, not in scattered volleys, but in a coordinated, sustained bombardment that seemed to come from every direction at once. The Titans, forced to defend their base, found themselves pinned down and unable to mount effective counterattacks. Zeus seized this moment to press the advantage, leading a direct assault on Olympus, while the Titans were occupied with defending against the rain of stones. His thunderbolts struck with devastating accuracy, targeting not just the Titans themselves, but the very foundations of their stronghold. The battle for Mount Olympus was fierce beyond description. Cronus and Zeus met in direct combat, father against son, the old king against the new challenger. Cronus fought with all the might of his age and experience, but Zeus fought with the power of destiny and the righteousness of his cause. Their battle shook the mountain to its core, and when Zeus's thunderbolt finally struck true, sending Cronus sprawling, the sight was enough to break the spirit of many of the remaining Titans. Atlas, who had served as the general of the Titan forces, fought on even as his allies began to falter. His strength was legendary, his endurance unmatched, but even he could not stand alone against the combined might of the Olympians and their allies. When Atlas finally fell, the last organized resistance of the Titans collapsed. The defeated Titans were rounded up and bound. Zeus, remembering the lessons of the past, knew that simply imprisoning them would not be enough. They needed to be contained in a place from which they could never escape, a place where they could do no harm to the new order that was being established. And so, the Titans were cast into Tartarus, that deepest and darkest of prisons. The same Cyclopes and Hecatonkaias who had helped win the war now became the jailers, guarding the gates of Tartarus to ensure that the Titans would never again threaten the peace of the cosmos. Bronze gates were forged and set in place, unbreakable and eternal, and behind those gates the Titans would remain for all time. But not all the Titans suffered this fate. Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had sided with Zeus, were spared and given places of honor among the new order. Themis, who had recognized the justice in Zeus's cause, became one of his most trusted advisors. And the female Titans, who had not fought in the war, were generally pardoned and allowed to maintain their positions in the cosmic hierarchy. Atlas, however, received a special punishment. He had been the general of the Titan forces, the one who had organized their resistance and prolonged the war. For this, Zeus decreed that Atlas would bear the weight of the sky upon his shoulders for all eternity, standing at the western edge of the world and holding the heavens aloft so that they would never again fall upon the earth. It was a punishment that fit the crime, a burden that would remind Atlas forever of the cost of opposing the will of fate and justice. With the Titanomachy concluded and the old order overthrown, Zeus and his siblings stood victorious. But victory in war is only the first step. The real challenge would be in establishing a lasting peace, in creating a system of governance that would be more just and more stable than what had come before. The age of the Titans was over. The age of the Olympians had begun, and Zeus, the youngest child of Cronus and Rhea, the hidden baby of Crete, the warrior who had led his siblings to victory, now faced the task of becoming a king. Dividing the cosmos. The three brothers in the aftermath of war, when the smoke had cleared and the earth began to heal from the wounds inflicted upon it, the victorious Olympians faced a question that had brought down kingdoms and shattered alliances since the beginning of time. How would they divide the spoils of victory? Zeus had led them to triumph, but he was not the only one who had fought and bled for the cause. Poseidon had commanded the seas and shaken the earth, turning the very ground beneath the Titans into a weapon against them. Hades had moved unseen through the battlefield, striking from the shadows and sowing confusion among the enemy ranks. The three brothers had each played crucial roles in the war, and each had a legitimate claim to a share of the power they had won. The sisters, too, had their places in the new order. Hestia, gentle and wise, would become the goddess of the hearth, the sacred center of every home. Demeter would claim dominion over the harvest and the growing things of the earth. Hera would become queen of the gods, standing at Zeus's side as his consort and equal. But it was understood that the primary division of power would be among the three brothers, for they had been the leaders of the war, and they represented the three great realms into which the cosmos could be divided. Some stories say that the three brothers drew lots to determine who would rule which realm. Others suggest that there was a negotiation, a discussion among equals who had fought together and now needed to find a way to rule together. Whatever the exact method, the outcome was a division that would define the structure of the cosmos from that point forward. To Zeus fell the sky, the broad heavens that stretched from horizon to horizon. He would command the clouds and the rain, the lightning and the thunder. The eagle would be his sacred bird, soaring high above all other creatures as Zeus himself would reign supreme among the gods. The sky was the most visible of the three realms, the one that touched all parts of the world, and it was fitting that Zeus, who had been the leader of the rebellion, should claim it as his own. To Poseidon fell the sea, the vast oceans that covered most of the world and the rivers that flowed through it. He would hold dominion over not just the water itself, but over all the creatures that lived within it, and all the islands that rose from its depths. With his trident, he could stir the waves to fury or calm them to glass-like smoothness. He could create springs where none had existed before, and dry up streams with a gesture. The sea was wild and unpredictable, rich with mystery and teeming with life, and Poseidon would rule it as its king, building his palace in the depths where the light of the sun could barely reach. To Hades fell the underworld, the realm of the dead. It was not a punishment, despite what later generations might think. The underworld was a necessary part of the cosmic order, a place where mortal souls would go after death, where they would be judged and assigned their eternal fate. Hades would become the steward of this realm, maintaining the balance between life and death, ensuring that the dead remained dead and that the living honored the boundary between the two states of existence. His kingdom was vast, extending beneath all the earth, filled with rivers and fields and regions of reward or punishment. And though his name would come to be feared and spoken only in whispers, Hades would prove to be one of the most just and steadfast of all the gods. The earth itself, the broad land where mortals would live and build their civilizations, was declared a common realm. No single god would claim exclusive dominion over it. Instead, It would be a place where all the gods could walk, where their influences would overlap and intersect. The mountains belonged to no one and to everyone. The forests were sacred to various deities. The fields would be blessed by Demeter, but they existed on land that was shared by all. This division was meant to prevent the kind of concentrated power that had led to tyranny under Cronus. By spreading authority across multiple realms and multiple gods, Zeus hoped to create a system of checks and balances that would keep any single deity from becoming too powerful or too corrupt. It was an attempt to learn from the mistakes of the past, to build something better and more lasting. Mount Olympus itself became the home of the Olympian gods, the place where they would gather for councils and feasts, where they would make decisions about the governance of the cosmos and the fate of mortals. The mountain was high enough that its summit was often hidden in clouds, creating a sense of separation between the divine and the mortal realms. But it was not so far removed that the gods could not descend to the earth below when they wished. Olympus was both a fortress and a symbol, a physical manifestation of the new order that Zeus and his siblings had established. Zeus took his place as king of the gods, first among equals. He would preside over the councils, mediate disputes, and ensure that divine law was upheld. His word would carry great weight, but he was not an absolute monarch in the way that Cronus had been. The other gods had their own spheres of influence, their own powers and responsibilities. Zeus's role was to coordinate, to maintain harmony among the diverse personalities and priorities of the divine family. But even as Zeus settled into his new position, even as the Olympians began to establish the routines and rituals of their governance, there were those who looked upon the new order with resentment or ambition. The war against the Titans had been won, but the world was not yet at peace. Other forces, older and more primordial, were stirring, and the greatest challenge to Zeus's rule was yet to come, not from his father's generation, but from the very depths of the earth itself. The challenge of Typhon, the most terrible battle. Gaia, the great Earth Mother, had watched the Titanomachy with conflicted feelings. On one hand, she had been the one to set these events in motion, encouraging Cronus to overthrow Uranus and later guiding Zeus to overthrow Cronus. She had wanted justice for her imprisoned children, and Zeus had delivered that justice by freeing the Cyclopes and the Hecatonkaias. But on the other hand, many of her children, the Titans, now languished in the depths of Tartarus, locked away just as the Cyclopes and Hecatonkaias had been under Uranus and Cronus. As the years passed and the Olympians consolidated their power, Gaia's resentment grew. According to the poet Hesiod, she joined with Tartarus, the abyss itself, and from this union was born a creature of such monstrous aspect and devastating power that the very sight of him would send shivers through the divine realm. Other traditions offer different accounts of Typhon's birth. Some claim Hera, angry at Zeus for birthing Athena from his own head, created Typhon on her own or with help from Cronus. But the most widely accepted version names Gaia and Tartarus as the parents, creating one final child who would challenge the Olympian order. His name was Typhon, and he was the most fearsome creature ever to walk the earth. Typhon was gigantic beyond comprehension. His body was humanoid in its basic shape, but there was nothing human about him. His head brushed the stars, and his arms, when spread wide, could reach from the eastern to the western horizon. Instead of fingers, serpents grew from his hands, hundreds of them, each hissing and snapping with venomous fangs. His legs were not legs at all, but massive coils of serpent flesh that could crush mountains. From his shoulders sprouted 100 dragon heads, each one capable of breathing fire or poison or both. His eyes glowed like forge fires, and when he spoke, his voice was not a single sound but a cacophony, the roaring of lions mixed with the bellowing of bulls and the hissing of serpents. When Typhon emerged from the depths and began his march toward Mount Olympus, the earth trembled with each step. Mountains crumbled in his wake. The sky darkened as his massive form blocked out the sun. The 100 dragon heads that sprouted from his body spewed fire in all directions, turning forests into infernos and boiling the seas where his shadow fell. The Olympian gods, seeing this monster approaching, felt something they had not experienced during the Titanomachy: true primal fear. This was not an enemy they could reason with or negotiate with. This was a force of pure destruction, created for the singular purpose of bringing down their rule. Many of the gods, faced with this overwhelming terror, fled. Some transformed themselves into animals and hid in the far corners of the earth. Others retreated to the deepest chambers of Olympus, hoping that the mountain itself would protect them. But Zeus did not flee. He stood at the summit of Olympus, his thunderbolts in hand, and watched as Typhon approached. He knew that this battle would be different from any he had fought before. The Titans had been powerful, but they were still gods, bound by certain rules and limitations. Typhon was something else entirely, a creature of chaos and destruction that existed outside the normal order of things. The battle between Zeus and Typhon began with a thunderclap that shook the entire world. Zeus hurled his mightiest bolts, each one striking Typhon with enough force to level a city. But Typhon barely seemed to notice. The dragon heads roared in response, and gouts of flame shot toward Olympus, forcing Zeus to dodge and weave in the air. The two titans of power circled each other, trading blows that sent shockwaves radiating outward, causing earthquakes and tsunamis across the mortal world below. Zeus struck Typhon with lightning again and again, scoring the monster's flesh and burning away some of the serpents that grew from his hands. But for every wound Zeus inflicted, Typhon seemed to grow more enraged, his attacks more ferocious. The dragon heads bit and snapped, their teeth sharp enough to tear through divine flesh. Their fire breath was so intense that it melted stone and metal, forcing Zeus to constantly move, never staying in one place long enough for Typhon to land a decisive blow. The battle raged for days, perhaps even weeks. Time became meaningless in the fury of divine combat. Zeus fought with every ounce of his considerable strength and skill, but gradually he began to tire. Typhon, born from the primordial powers of earth and abyss, seemed to have endless reserves of energy. Slowly but surely, the monster began to gain the upper hand. In a moment of distraction, Typhon struck. His coiled tail lashed out and wrapped around Zeus, pinning the god's arms to his sides and squeezing with crushing force. The serpents that formed Typhon's fingers bit into Zeus's flesh, injecting venom that weakened him further. The dragon heads closed in, ready to tear the king of the gods apart. But Typhon had a different plan. Rather than killing Zeus outright, he wanted to humiliate him, to render him powerless and harmless. With his terrible strength, Typhon tore the sinews from Zeus's body, the divine tendons that gave him his strength and mobility. Without these, Zeus was helpless, unable to move or wield his thunderbolts. Typhon carried the crippled god to a cave in Cilicia and left him there, guarded by the she-dragon Delphine, while he continued his march toward Olympus to claim the throne for himself. The situation seemed hopeless. The king of the gods lay helpless in a cave, his sinews stolen, his power stripped away. The other Olympians were scattered and hiding. Typhon was on the verge of overthrowing the entire cosmic order and plunging the world into chaos. But even in this darkest hour, help came from an unexpected source. Hermes, the swift messenger god who was Zeus's son, learned of his father's plight. The ancient sources differ on exactly who helped him. Some say it was Pan, the rustic god of the wild places, while others name Egipan, a deity sometimes identified with Pan. Working together, they snuck into the cave where Zeus was being held. They distracted or defeated Delphine, the accounts vary, and retrieved the stolen sinews. With careful and painful work, they restored Zeus's tendons to his body, and gradually, the king of the gods regained his strength. Zeus rose from his imprisonment with a fury unlike anything he had shown before. He ascended to the peak of Mount Olympus and called forth every thunderbolt the Cyclopes had ever made for him. He gathered the storm clouds around him until the sky turned black, and then he went to face Typhon once more, but this time with a full knowledge of what he was fighting and what was at stake. The second confrontation between Zeus and Typhon was even more cataclysmic than the first. Zeus unleashed his thunderbolts in a continuous barrage, not giving Typhon a moment to recover or counterattack. He struck the monster with lightning so intense that it lit up the entire sky like a second sun. The dragon heads were burned away one by one. The serpents that formed Typhon's fingers were reduced to ash. The monster's massive form was scorched and battered by the relentless assault. Typhon roared and fought back, spewing fire and poison, lashing out with his coiled tail, trying desperately to land a blow that would turn the tide once more. But Zeus had learned from their first encounter. He stayed mobile, dodging and weaving, never allowing Typhon to pin him down or get close enough to use his superior physical strength. Gradually, inevitably, Typhon began to weaken. His movements became slower. His fire breath grew less intense. And when Zeus saw his opening, he took it. With a final massive thunderbolt, forged from the combined power of sky and storm, Zeus struck Typhon directly in the chest, sending the monster reeling backward. But killing Typhon outright proved impossible. Or perhaps Zeus simply didn't want to risk having such a creature's essence dispersed into the world. The ancient sources disagree on Typhon's final fate. Some traditions claim Zeus cast the monster into Tartarus, that deepest of prisons, to languish forever alongside the defeated Titans. But the more common telling is that Zeus carried Typhon's massive body through the air to the island of Sicily. There he found Mount Etna, a volcanic peak that suited his purposes perfectly. With tremendous effort, Zeus lifted the entire mountain and hurled it down upon Typhon, burying the monster beneath its weight. Typhon was trapped, alive but immobilized, crushed beneath the mass of Mount Etna, and there he would remain, though his presence could still be felt. When Mount Etna erupted, as it would do from time to time throughout history, it was said to be Typhon's fire breath escaping from beneath the mountain. When the ground shook in Sicily, it was Typhon struggling against his bonds. The monster had been defeated but not destroyed, a permanent reminder of the challenge that chaos poses to order, and of the price Zeus had to pay to maintain his rule. The victory over Typhon secured Zeus's position as king of the gods in a way that even the Titanomachy had not. He had faced the most terrible creature ever to exist and had prevailed, not just through his own strength, but through his determination, his willingness to endure suffering, and his refusal to abandon his responsibilities even when the situation seemed hopeless. The other gods, who had fled in terror at Typhon's approach, returned to Olympus and acknowledged Zeus's supremacy with new respect and new understanding. He was not just powerful, he was worthy of the throne he held. But the battle with Typhon had another consequence that would echo through the ages. It had shown Zeus and everyone else that his rule was not invulnerable, that there were forces in the world that could threaten even the king of the gods. It was a sobering lesson, one that would make Zeus more vigilant and, in some ways, more cautious about potential threats to his authority. The age of great wars was not quite over yet, but after Typhon, the nature of the challenges Zeus would face would change. The threats would become more subtle, more personal, and in their own way, just as dangerous as any monster. The Gigantomachy, war against the giants even after the defeat of Typhon, Gaia's resentment toward the Olympians had not abated. Her children, the Titans, remained imprisoned in Tartarus. Typhon, her last and most terrible son, lay crushed beneath Mount Etna. The Olympians ruled the cosmos, but they had not, in Gaia's view, honored the ancient powers from which they had sprung. And so, the Earth Mother stirred once more, calling forth another generation of beings to challenge Zeus and his kin. The giants were born from the blood of Uranus, the same blood that had fallen upon the earth when Cronus had castrated his father in the ancient days. But where that blood had previously given rise to the Furies and the Melii, now it produced warriors of terrible aspect and immense power. These were not the refined, divine beings that the Titans had been. The giants were primitive and brutal, creatures of war and destruction, each one a towering figure of muscle and rage. There were many giants, though the exact number varies in different tellings. What all accounts agree on is that they were formidable opponents, each possessing strength that rivaled the gods themselves. They wore armor made from the hides of dragons and wielded weapons fashioned from tree trunks and boulders. Their very presence caused the earth to shake, and when they moved in formation, it was like an earthquake given purpose and direction. Gaia had imbued the giants with a special protection. They could not be killed by gods alone. An ancient prophecy declared that the giants could only be slain if a mortal fought alongside the gods in battle. This was Gaia's way of ensuring that the Olympians could not simply use their divine power to crush the rebellion. They would need the help of mortals, beings far weaker than themselves, beings they might otherwise have overlooked or dismissed. The giants began their assault by piling mountains upon mountains, creating great ramps that would allow them to climb to the heights of Olympus and assault the gods in their own home. This war would be called the Gigantomachy, and though it would not last as long as the Titanomachy, it would be no less fierce. Zeus, learning of the prophecy, knew that he needed to find a mortal champion, a human being with strength and courage enough to stand against the giants. His choice fell upon Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, a man who was himself half divine, being the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene. Heracles had already performed many great labors, and had proven himself time and again as a warrior without equal among mortals. With Heracles fighting alongside them, the gods went to war against the giants. The battles took place across many locations, from the plains of Phlegra to the slopes of Olympus itself. Each encounter was a desperate struggle, with the giants proving themselves more than capable of standing against the divine might of the Olympians. Zeus himself fought against many of the giants, striking them down with his thunderbolts, while Heracles finished them off with his arrows dipped in the poison of the Hydra. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, proved herself a formidable warrior, crushing the giant Enceladus beneath the weight of the entire island of Sicily. She also flayed another giant, Pallas, and wore his skin as armor, a grisly trophy of her victory. Poseidon pursued the giant Polybotes across the sea, and finally trapped him by breaking off a piece of the island of Kos and hurling it upon him, creating the small island of Nisyros. Hades battled against other giants, using his helm of invisibility to strike from unexpected angles. Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins, worked together to bring down several giants with their unerring arrows, always ensuring that Heracles was present to deal the final mortal blow. The war raged on, with victories on both sides. The giants were fierce and relentless, driven by Gaia's will and their own hatred of the Olympian order. But gradually, the combination of divine power and mortal courage began to turn the tide. One by one, the giants fell. Some were buried beneath mountains or islands. Others were struck down by divine weapons and finished by Heracles' arrows. The earth shook with each death, as if Gaia herself was crying out in anguish at the loss of these children. The final and greatest of the giants was Porphyrion, their king. He was more powerful than any of his brothers, and he harbored a particular hatred for Zeus. In the climactic battle, Porphyrion actually attempted to assault Hera, Zeus's wife, an act that filled the king of the gods with such rage that his thunderbolts blazed brighter than ever before. Zeus struck Porphyrion with a bolt that stunned the giant king, and then Heracles rushed in to deliver the killing blow, ending the last great threat of the Gigantomachy. With the defeat of the giants, Gaia's attempts to overthrow the Olympian order finally came to an end. She had tried. 3 times, first by helping Zeus overthrow Cronus, then by creating Typhon, and finally by raising the giants, to shape or control the rule of the cosmos. Each time, the result had been bloodshed and upheaval. Now, exhausted and grieving, the Earth Mother withdrew from the affairs of the gods. She would continue to exist, would continue to be honored and respected, but she would no longer actively seek to overthrow or influence the rule of Olympus. The Gigantomachy marked the end of the great cosmic wars that had defined the early ages of the world. Zeus had now defeated 3 separate attempts to overthrow his rule: the Titans, Typhon, and the giants. His position was secure in a way that no previous ruler of the cosmos had ever enjoyed. But with security came new challenges and new responsibilities. The battles were over, but the work of governance was just beginning. And for Zeus, the next chapter of his reign would involve not monsters or rebels, but the complex, messy, and often problematic relationships that would define him in the eyes of both gods and mortals. Zeus and Hera. The divine marriage in the wake of the great wars, Zeus turned his attention to establishing a more permanent and stable order on Olympus. Part of that order involved taking a queen, a goddess who would stand at his side and help him rule the divine realm. His choice fell upon Hera, his sister, who had been by his side through the Titanomachy, and who possessed both the divine authority and the personal strength to serve as queen of the gods. But the courtship between Zeus and Hera was not simple or straightforward. Hera, proud and independent, did not immediately agree to become Zeus's consort. She valued her autonomy and was wary of binding herself to a marriage that might limit her freedom or reduce her to a mere appendage of the king. Zeus, for his part, was determined to win her, but he understood that Hera could not be commanded or compelled. She would need to be wooed. The stories tell of Zeus's pursuit of Hera through various means. In one telling, he transformed himself into a bedraggled cuckoo bird, shivering in the cold. Hera, moved by pity for the creature, took it into her arms to warm it. Once he was close to her, Zeus revealed his true form and declared his love. Even then, Hera did not immediately consent, extracting promises from Zeus about how their marriage would be conducted and what her role would be. When the marriage finally took place, it was celebrated across all of creation. The gods gathered on Olympus for a feast that lasted for days. The earth itself brought forth new flowers to honor the union. The seasons performed a dance. The muses sang songs of praise. It was meant to be the perfect divine marriage, a partnership between equals that would serve as the model for all marriages to come. And in many ways, it was. Hera became the queen of Olympus and the goddess of marriage and family. She took her responsibilities seriously, protecting the institution of marriage and punishing those who violated its bonds. She was a powerful deity in her own right, commanding respect and even fear from the other gods. When she spoke in the councils of Olympus, her words carried weight. Zeus might be the king, but Hera was very much the queen, not merely in title but in authority and influence. But the marriage between Zeus and Hera was also, from the very beginning, troubled by one enormous problem: Zeus's infidelity. Despite his vows to Hera, despite the promises he had made during their courtship, Zeus could not seem to remain faithful to his wife. Time and again, he would be seized by desire for another being, whether goddess, nymph, or mortal woman, and he would pursue that desire regardless of the consequences. At first, Hera might have hoped that these were isolated incidents, youthful indiscretions that Zeus would outgrow as he matured into his role as king and husband. But as the years passed and the affairs continued, it became clear that this was not a phase but a fundamental aspect of Zeus's character. His appetites were enormous, his desires seemingly boundless, and his willingness to pursue those desires regardless of how it might hurt Hera or violate the sanctity of their marriage was a constant source of pain and rage for the queen of the gods. Hera's response to Zeus's infidelities became legendary. She could not directly challenge Zeus himself. He was, after all, the king of the gods, and an open confrontation between them might tear apart the divine order they had worked to establish. But she could and did take her revenge on the objects of Zeus's affection and on the children born from his affairs. Her vengeance was creative and terrible. When Zeus impregnated the Titaness Leto, Hera forbade any land under the sun from giving the poor woman shelter to give birth. Leto wandered the earth in labor, desperate and suffering, until she finally found the floating island of Delos, which was not technically under the sun and thus not subject to Hera's decree. There, in terrible pain and fear, Leto gave birth to the twin gods Apollo and Artemis. When Zeus fell in love with the princess Semele and got her pregnant, Hera disguised herself as the girl's nurse and convinced her to ask Zeus to appear before her in his true divine form. Zeus, bound by an oath to grant Semele anything she asked, had no choice but to comply. When he revealed himself in his full glory, his divine fire was too much for mortal flesh to bear. Semele was consumed, burned to ash by the radiance of the god she loved. Zeus was able to save their unborn child, Dionysus, by sewing the infant into his own thigh to complete the gestation, but Semele herself was lost. The mortal woman Io, whom Zeus desired, was transformed into a cow to hide her from Hera's wrath. But Hera was not fooled. She demanded the cow as a gift and set the 100-eyed giant Argus to watch over it, ensuring that Zeus could not approach. Zeus eventually sent Hermes to slay Argus and free Io, but Hera then sent a gadfly to torment the cow-woman, driving her in a mad flight across the known world. Perhaps the most famous victim of Hera's wrath was Heracles, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene. Hera hated Heracles from the moment of his birth, seeing him as living proof of Zeus's betrayal. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, but even as an infant, Heracles was strong enough to strangle the snakes. When that failed, Hera struck him with madness, causing him to kill his own wife and children in a fit of insane rage. The famous 12 labors of Heracles were imposed upon him as penance for this crime, and though Heracles eventually completed them and earned immortality, his entire life was marked by suffering that stemmed directly from Hera's hatred. The relationship between Zeus and Hera thus became one of the great tragic partnerships of mythology. They loved each other in their own way. They respected each other's power and position. They worked together to maintain the order of Olympus and to fulfill their divine responsibilities. But they also hurt each other, deeply and repeatedly. Zeus's inability to remain faithful was a constant wound to Hera's pride and heart. Hera's vengeful nature and her willingness to punish innocent parties for Zeus's crimes created suffering that spread far beyond Olympus itself. Their arguments were legendary, shaking the halls of Olympus with their intensity. Sometimes these disputes would escalate to the point where other gods would have to intervene, fearing that the conflict between king and queen might spill over into something that threatened the stability of the entire divine realm. Yet despite everything, they remained bound to each other, unable or unwilling to break the marriage that defined both of their roles in the cosmos. In their marriage, we can see many of the themes that would define Zeus's character throughout his mythic life. His power and authority were undeniable, but he used that power in ways that were not always just or honorable. His desires were vast, but his willingness to consider the consequences of satisfying those desires was limited. He demanded loyalty from others, but did not always offer the same loyalty in return. And yet, he was also capable of genuine love, of fighting fiercely to protect those he cared about, of maintaining the cosmic order even when his personal life was in chaos. Hera, for her part, embodied the pain and rage of the wronged spouse, but also the determination to maintain her dignity and her position despite the humiliation she suffered. She was a goddess of marriage who was herself trapped in a marriage that violated the very principles she represented. Her story is one of strength and suffering intertwined, of power exercised in ways that were both righteous and cruel, often at the same time. Together, Zeus and Hera represented the complex, contradictory nature of power and relationship, of how love and hurt can coexist, of how institutions like marriage can be both sacred and deeply flawed. Their story would play out across the ages, involving countless other beings in their drama, spreading consequences both divine and mortal across the entire cosmos. And at the center of it all was Zeus, the king of the gods, whose desires and decisions would shape the course of mythic history. The many loves of Zeus. Divine affairs to catalogue all of Zeus's romantic entanglements would be a task that could fill volumes. The king of the gods seemed to fall in love, or at least into desire, with remarkable frequency, and his affairs produced children who would themselves become gods, heroes, muses, and monsters. His lovers came from all strata of existence, goddesses and titanesses, nymphs and spirits, and mortal women of every station from princess to peasant. Among his divine lovers, Metis holds a special place in the mythology, for she was the first. Metis, the Titaness of wisdom and wise counsel, had helped Zeus defeat Cronus by crafting the potion that made the Titan king regurgitate his swallowed children. After the Titanomachy, Zeus took Metis as a lover, and she became pregnant. But a prophecy emerged, warning that Metis would bear two children, first a daughter who would be the equal of Zeus in wisdom, and then a son who would be greater than his father and would eventually overthrow him. Zeus, remembering his father's fate and his grandfather's before that, could not allow the prophecy to fulfill itself. He could not simply swallow the child, as Cronus had done, because the child was not yet born. According to some accounts, Metis attempted to escape Zeus by transforming herself into many different forms, but he eventually caught and swallowed her whole. Other traditions suggest Zeus tricked her into becoming a fly, making it easy for him to swallow her. However it happened, Metis found herself trapped within Zeus, along with her unborn child. This was meant to be the end of the threat, but the story doesn't end there. Some time later, Zeus developed a terrible headache, a pain so intense that it threatened to drive him mad. He called upon Hephaestus, the smith god, to split open his skull with an axe. When Hephaestus did so, fully grown and fully armed goddess sprang forth from Zeus's head, Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. She was the daughter Metis had been carrying, and by being born from Zeus's head rather than in the normal way, she became his child alone, owing nothing to her mother who remained trapped inside the king of the gods. Leto, the Titaness of motherhood and modesty, bore Zeus two of the most important Olympian gods. Despite Hera's attempts to prevent her from finding a place to give birth, Leto managed to deliver the twins Apollo and Artemis on the island of Delos. Apollo would become the god of prophecy, music, healing, and the sun, while Artemis would be the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and wild animals. Both would become major figures in the Olympian pantheon, respected and feared by gods and mortals alike. Themis, the Titaness of divine law and order, was another of Zeus's divine consorts. She was one of the few who seemed to maintain a positive relationship with Zeus even after their romantic involvement ended. Themis bore Zeus the Ori, goddesses who represented the seasons and the natural order of time. They were Eunomia, good order, Dike, justice, and Irene, peace. Themis also gave birth to the Moirai, known to the Romans as the Fates. These three sisters, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, spun, measured, and cut the thread of life for every mortal, and even influenced the destinies of the gods themselves. The Fates were so fundamental to the cosmic order that even Zeus could not overrule their decrees. Mnemosyne, Titaness of memory, lay with Zeus for 9 consecutive nights, and from this union came the 9 Muses. These divine sisters would become the inspirations for all artistic endeavors, each presiding over a different domain of art and knowledge. Calliope ruled epic poetry, Clio history, Erato love poetry, Euterpe music, Melpomene tragedy, Polyhymnia hymns, Terpsichore dance, Thalia comedy, and Urania astronomy. The Muses would play crucial roles in inspiring mortal artists, poets, and thinkers throughout the ages. Eurynome, a daughter of Ocean, bore Zeus the three Charites, known to the Romans as the Graces. These goddesses personified beauty, charm, and grace in all its forms. They were Aglaia, splendor, Euphrosyne, mirth, and Thalia, good cheer. The Graces often attended Aphrodite and were associated with the refinements of civilization and the pleasures of life. Demeter, Zeus's own sister and the goddess of agriculture and the harvest, bore him a daughter named Persephone. This child would grow to become one of the most important goddesses in Greek mythology, though her story would be marked by trauma when Hades, Zeus's brother, abducted her to become his queen in the underworld. Zeus's role in this abduction, whether he actively conspired in it or merely failed to prevent it, has been a source of much discussion, but what is clear is that his daughter's suffering had his brother's desire and possibly his own approval at its root. Perhaps the most unexpected of Zeus's divine affairs was with the goddess Dione, about whom little is known except that she bore him a daughter. In some traditions, this daughter was Aphrodite, though other stories claim Aphrodite was born from the sea foam created by Uranus's severed genitals. The genealogy of the gods is often contradictory, with different traditions offering different accounts of the same deity's origins. Zeus also had relationships with various nymphs, those lesser divine beings who inhabited specific locations or natural features. The nymph Maia, who lived in a cave on Mount Cyllene, bore Zeus a son named Hermes. Hermes would grow up to become the messenger of the gods, patron of travelers and thieves, and one of Zeus's most trusted servants. The infant Hermes showed his cleverness from the very beginning, stealing Apollo's cattle on the day of his birth and inventing the lyre to appease the angry god of music. Teiogite, a nymph of the Pleiades, bore Zeus a son named Lacedaemon, who would become the founder of Sparta. The story of Teiogite is one tinged with sadness, as she tried to avoid Zeus's advances by begging Artemis to transform her, but Zeus found a way to have his will regardless. Another of the Pleiades, Electra, gave Zeus two sons, Dardanus and Iasion. Dardanus would go on to found the royal line of Troy, making him an ancestor of Aeneas and thus, through Roman mythology, an ancestor of the Roman people themselves. This connection would be used by later Romans to justify their rule and to claim divine ancestry. Not all of Zeus's divine relationships were with those who welcomed his advances. Some stories hint at coercion or trickery, methods Zeus used to overcome the reluctance of his intended partners. These aspects of the myths are troubling to modern readers, reflecting as they do the patriarchal values of ancient Greek society, where male gods' desires often overrode female autonomy. The myths present these actions without explicit moral judgment, treating them as simply part of the way the cosmos worked, though the consequences, particularly in the form of Hera's wrath, certainly suggest that the Greeks understood these affairs to be violations of social and divine order, even if they were violations committed by the king of the gods himself. What all these divine affairs had in common was their productivity. Nearly every union between Zeus and a goddess, Titaness, or nymph produced offspring who would play important roles in the mythological tradition. These children became gods and goddesses in their own right, or they became the ancestors of important mortal lineages. Through his many affairs, Zeus spread his divine essence throughout the cosmos, ensuring that his influence touched every aspect of existence from the heights of Olympus to the depths of the mortal world. The many loves of Zeus, mortal encounters if Zeus's affairs with goddesses and nymphs were numerous, his encounters with mortal women were even more so. The king of the gods seemed to have a particular fascination with mortal beauty and mortal life, despite, or perhaps because of, its fleeting nature. These relationships with mortals were complicated by the vast gulf in power and immortality that separated Zeus from his human lovers, and they almost always ended in tragedy for the mortal woman involved, and often for the children born from these unions. One of the most famous of Zeus's mortal loves was Europa, a Phoenician princess of extraordinary beauty. Zeus first saw her playing by the seashore with her companions and was immediately smitten. But he knew that approaching her in his divine form would frighten her, and given his size and power as a god, might actually harm her. So Zeus transformed himself into a beautiful white bull, gentle and tame, and wandered onto the beach where Europa played. Europa was charmed by the bull and began to play with it, adorning its horns with flowers and eventually climbing onto its back. The moment she was seated, Zeus plunged into the sea and swam away, carrying the terrified princess across the waters to the island of Crete. There, he revealed his true identity and made her his lover. Europa bore Zeus 3 sons: Minos, who would become the legendary king of Crete and later a judge in the underworld; Rhadamanthys, who would also become a judge of the dead; and Sarpedon, who would become a king and a hero in his own right. Though Zeus eventually left Europa, as he always did with his mortal lovers, he did ensure that she was well cared for. She married the king of Crete and became a queen, and the continent where she had been abducted from would eventually bear her name, Europe. Danae was the daughter of King Acrisius of Argos, who had been warned by an oracle that his daughter's son would kill him. To prevent this prophecy, Acrisius locked Danae in a bronze tower or chamber, where no man could reach her. But Zeus, who desired Danae, found a way to circumvent this obstacle. He transformed himself into a shower of golden rain and fell through the roof of her prison, impregnating her in this unusual form. When Danae gave birth to a son, Perseus, Acrisius was furious and terrified, unable to bring himself to directly kill his daughter and grandson. Such a crime would bring down the wrath of the gods. He instead placed them in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. Zeus watched over them, ensuring that they drifted safely to the island of Seriphos, where they were rescued by a fisherman. Perseus would grow up to become one of the greatest of Greek heroes, slaying the Gorgon Medusa and later accidentally fulfilling the prophecy by killing his grandfather in a discus-throwing accident. Leda, the queen of Sparta, encountered Zeus in the form of a swan. In this shape, he either seduced or assaulted her. The myths are ambiguous. On the same night she lay with her husband, King Tyndareus. The result was that Leda produced 2 eggs, from which hatched 4 children. The paternity was divided between Zeus and Tyndareus. Helen and Polydeuces were Zeus's children, and thus immortal or semi-divine, while Clytemnestra and Castor were mortal children of Tyndareus. Helen would grow up to become Helen of Troy, whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships and begin the Trojan War. Polydeuces and Castor would become the Dioscuri, the twin heroes known for their brotherly devotion. Alcmene of Thebes was married to Amphitryon when Zeus desired her, but Alcmene was famously faithful to her husband, so Zeus employed a particularly elaborate deception. He took on the exact form of Amphitryon and came to Alcmene when her real husband was away at war. To extend the night and his time with her, Zeus commanded the sun not to rise, making one night last as long as 3. When Alcmene became pregnant, she actually carried twins: Heracles, the son of Zeus, and Iphicles, the son of her mortal husband, conceived when the real Amphitryon returned. Heracles would become the greatest of all Greek heroes, performing the 12 labors and eventually earning his place among the gods on Olympus after his death. Semele, as mentioned earlier, was a princess of Thebes who caught Zeus's eye. Their affair went well until Hera, in disguise, convinced Semele to ask Zeus to appear to her in his true form. When Zeus reluctantly complied, bound by his oath to grant her any wish, Semele was incinerated by his divine radiance. Zeus rescued their unborn child, Dionysus, and sewed him into his own thigh to finish the gestation. Dionysus would become the god of wine, theatre, and religious ecstasy, and his cult would spread throughout the ancient world, offering mortals a direct, intoxicated connection to the divine. Antiope was a princess who, depending on the version of the myth, was either seduced by Zeus in the form of a satyr, or raped by him. She fled from her father's anger and gave birth to twin sons, Amphion and Zethus, who were exposed on a mountainside but survived and were raised by shepherds. They would eventually return to claim their birthright and become the founders of Thebes. Callisto was a nymph and a follower of Artemis, sworn to virginity. Zeus desired her and, according to some versions, took the form of Artemis herself to get close to her, then revealed his true identity and had his way with her. When Callisto became pregnant, she tried to hide it, but during a bath with the other followers of Artemis, her condition became obvious. Artemis, who demanded absolute purity from her followers, was furious and transformed Callisto into a bear. Later, after Callisto had given birth to a son named Arcus, Zeus placed her in the sky as the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear. Arcus eventually became the constellation Ursa Minor. Io was a priestess of Hera, which makes Zeus's pursuit of her particularly audacious. When Hera became suspicious of her husband's interest in Io, Zeus transformed the girl into a white heifer to hide her. But Hera was not fooled and demanded the cow as a gift, then set the 100-eyed giant Argus Panoptes to guard her. Zeus sent Hermes to slay Argus, and Hera placed the giant's eyes in the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock. She then sent a gadfly to torment Io, driving the cow-woman on a mad journey across the known world. Io eventually reached Egypt, where Zeus restored her to human form, and she gave birth to his son Epiphus, who would become the ancestor of a great lineage. Aegina was another of Zeus's mortal lovers, and their son Aeacus would become a king renowned for his justice and piety. When a plague depopulated Aeacus' island kingdom, Zeus transformed ants into people to repopulate it, creating the Myrmidons, who would later serve as the fierce warriors under Achilles in the Trojan War. The catalogue could continue almost endlessly. Zeus fathered the Spartans through Taygetus, the Trojans through Electra, and eventually Dardanus, the Macedonians through other liaisons. He seduced or assaulted women of every social class, from queens and princesses to nymphs and ordinary mortals. His transformations to accomplish these seductions were creative and varied. He became a bull, a swan, a satyr, a shower of gold, an eagle, even another person. Each transformation was crafted specifically to overcome the particular obstacles between him and his desired partner. What is striking about these mortal affairs is not just their number, but their pattern. Nearly all of them involve deception of some kind. Nearly all of them result in suffering for the mortal woman involved, whether from the jealousy of Hera, the anger of mortal family members, or simply the tragedy of loving a being who would never truly be present in their lives. And nearly all of them produce children who would face extraordinary challenges precisely because of their divine parentage. The children born from Zeus's mortal affairs often became heroes, individuals who stood between the mortal and divine worlds, possessing abilities beyond normal humans but lacking the immortality and full power of the gods. They accomplished great deeds, slaying monsters, founding cities, leading armies, but they also suffered greatly. Heracles was driven mad and forced to perform impossible labors. Perseus was cast into the sea as an infant. Helen of Troy became the cause of history's most famous war. Being a child of Zeus brought glory, but it also brought suffering, danger, and the ever-present risk of drawing Hera's wrath. For Zeus himself, these affairs seem to have been driven by an insatiable desire that went beyond simple lust. There was an element of conquest in many of these seductions, a need to prove his power and reach by coupling with beings across all of creation. There was also perhaps a fascination with mortality itself, a desire to experience, or at least touch, that which was most foreign to an immortal god, the brief, intense life of a human being. Through his mortal lovers and his semi-divine children, Zeus connected himself to the mortal world in ways that other gods rarely achieved. But the cost of this connection was borne primarily by others. The mortal women who Zeus pursued rarely had happy endings. Their children faced lives of exceptional challenge and often exceptional sorrow. And Hera's rage, though arguably misdirected away from Zeus himself and toward his lovers and children, created a cascade of suffering that spread across generations. Zeus's appetites and his power to satisfy them created ripples of consequence that touched countless lives, divine and mortal alike, leaving a complex legacy of both glory and grief. Children of Zeus. Gods and heroes, the progeny of Zeus, formed a who's who of Greek mythology, a catalogue of gods, goddesses, heroes, and founders of great lineages. To understand Zeus is in many ways to understand his children, for they carried his essence into the world and expressed different aspects of his nature and power. Among the Olympian gods born to Zeus, Athena held a special place. Emerging fully grown and fully armed from Zeus's head, she inherited her father's capacity for strategic thinking and just rule, but combined it with a wisdom and restraint that Zeus himself often lacked. Athena became the patron goddess of Athens, the embodiment of civilized arts and sciences, and one of the most respected deities in the Greek pantheon. Her birth from Zeus alone, without a mother's involvement, made her uniquely his child, and he trusted her with many important tasks, including carrying his aegis, the shield that bore the head of Medusa. Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins born to Leto, represented complementary aspects of divine power. Apollo became associated with the sun, with prophecy and truth-telling, with music and poetry, and with healing. His oracle at Delphi was the most famous in all of Greece, and his word was taken as Zeus's own will made manifest. Artemis, by contrast, was the goddess of the moon, of hunting and wild places, of childbirth and the protection of young women. Together, they represented a kind of balanced duality, male and female, sun and moon, civilization and wilderness. Hermes, born to the nymph Maia, became Zeus's most trusted messenger and servant. His cleverness and speed made him indispensable for carrying Zeus's commands throughout the cosmos, and his role as a trickster god meant he could accomplish tasks that required cunning as much as power. Hermes was also the guide of souls to the underworld, the patron of travelers and merchants, and the god of boundaries and transitions. His relationship with Zeus was one of mutual respect and even affection, a rare dynamic in Zeus's relationships with his children. Dionysus, born from Semele and gestated in Zeus's thigh, was perhaps the most unusual of Zeus's divine children. As the god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre, Dionysus represented a kind of divine madness, a breaking down of social boundaries and civilized restraints. His cult appealed particularly to women and to those on the margins of society, offering them a direct, intoxicated experience of the divine. Zeus's unusual role in Dionysus's birth, serving as both father and, in a sense, mother, created a special bond between them, and Dionysus's eventual ascension to Olympus as a full-fledged god showed Zeus's willingness to expand the pantheon and adapt to changing religious needs. The Muses, born to the Titaness Mnemosyne, represented the inspirational aspect of Zeus's power. Through them, Zeus influenced mortal arts and sciences, ensuring that human creativity and knowledge would continue to grow and develop. The Muses were not warriors or rulers, but teachers and inspirations, showing a different side of what divine power could accomplish. The Fates, if they were indeed Zeus's daughters by Themis, as some traditions claim, represented perhaps the most profound paradox of his reign. These three sisters controlled destiny itself, spinning, measuring, and cutting the threads of life. Even Zeus could not overrule their decrees, which raises the question, was Zeus truly all-powerful, or was he himself subject to forces greater than any individual god? The existence of the Fates suggested that the cosmos operated according to laws that even the king of the gods could not violate, a limitation that Zeus seemed to accept with wisdom, even if he sometimes tested its boundaries. Among Zeus's mortal children, the heroes stood out as beings who straddled the line between human and divine. Heracles was the greatest of these, a man of tremendous strength who performed labors that seemed impossible for any mortal. His life was marked by suffering, largely thanks to Hera's persecution, but also by accomplishment and eventual glorification. After his death, Zeus brought Heracles to Olympus and made him a god, a rare honor that showed Zeus's love for his son and his willingness to reward those who achieved greatness through suffering and perseverance. Perseus, with his heroic slaying of Medusa and rescue of Andromeda, established himself as a prototypical Greek hero. His adventures involved confronting monsters, rescuing maidens, and eventually founding new kingdoms. Zeus watched over him, ensuring that his schemes against him by Acrisius failed and that Perseus would accomplish his destined greatness. Helen of Sparta, whose beauty would famously launch the Trojan War, showed that Zeus's children were not always warriors or adventurers. Sometimes they were simply extraordinary individuals whose mere existence changed the course of history. Helen's abduction, or elopement, depending on which version you believe, with Paris of Troy set in motion events that would destroy one great city and threaten many others, demonstrating how Zeus's bloodline carried weight in the mortal world. Dioscuri, Castor, and Polydeuces showed the complicated nature of mixed paternity. Though born from the same mother at the same time, one was mortal and one was immortal due to their different fathers. Their bond was so strong that when the mortal Castor died, his divine brother chose to share his immortality, spending alternating days in Olympus and in Hades so they would never be separated. Zeus honored this devotion by placing them in the sky as the constellation Gemini. Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus, sons of Zeus who became famous for their justice and wisdom in life, were made judges of the dead after their deaths. In the underworld, they sat in judgment of every soul that entered, determining whether they would be sent to the Elysian fields, to the neutral plains, or to Tartarus for punishment. Through these sons, Zeus extended his influence even into the realm of Hades, ensuring that justice would prevail even after death. The descendants of Zeus's children often became founders of great cities and kingdoms. The lineage from Dardanus led to the Trojan royal house. The lineage from Heracles produced countless heroes and eventually Alexander the Great, who claimed descent from both Heracles and Perseus. The Spartan kings traced their ancestry back to Zeus through various lines. In this way, Zeus's influence extended through generations, with mortal rulers claiming divine descent to legitimize their power and authority. What united all of Zeus's children, whether divine or mortal, was a kind of exceptional quality that set them apart from their peers. The gods born to Zeus became major figures in the pantheon, wielding significant power and commanding widespread worship. The heroes born to Zeus accomplished deeds that ordinary mortals could barely imagine. Even those descendants who were several generations removed from Zeus often showed traces of that divine essence, achieving greatness in war, leadership, or wisdom. But being a child of Zeus was not simply a blessing. It came with expectations and challenges that could crush those who were not strong enough to bear them. Heracles suffered through madness and labor after labor. Perseus was cast out to die before he could even walk. Many of Zeus's children became entangled in the conflicts between their father and Hera, suffering for crimes they had not committed. The divine blood that ran through their veins made them targets as much as it made them exceptional. Zeus's relationships with his children varied greatly. With some, like Athena and Apollo, he maintained close bonds, trusting them with important responsibilities and valuing their counsel. With others, like many of his mortal children, he was largely absent, intervening only occasionally to protect them from the worst dangers or to guide them toward their destined paths. He loved his children in his own way, but his love was filtered through his nature as a god, vast, powerful, but also somewhat detached from the intimate day-to-day aspects of parenthood that mortals would recognize. The sheer number of Zeus's offspring also speaks to something fundamental about his role in Greek mythology. He was not just a king or a warrior or a judge. He was a creative force, a being whose essence was meant to spread through the cosmos, touching every level of existence. Through his children, Zeus ensured that divine blood flowed through both the immortal and mortal realms, that gods and humans remained connected, and that the influence of Olympus extended into every corner of the world. This fecundity also served a practical purpose in Greek religious thought. Many noble families claimed descent from Zeus, which gave them divine legitimacy and authority. Many cities claimed special relationships with Zeus or his children, which provided them with religious identity and prestige. The worship of Zeus was thus intimately connected with the worship of his many children, creating a network of divine relationships that touched virtually every aspect of Greek religious life. Yet for all his children's accomplishments and all the glory associated with being Zeus's offspring, there was also a tragic dimension to these relationships. The children of Zeus often found themselves caught between worlds, too divine to be fully human, too mortal to be fully divine. They witnessed things that ordinary mortals never saw, accomplished things that ordinary mortals never could, but they also suffered in ways that ordinary mortals might be spared. Their lives were larger, brighter, more significant, but also more dangerous and more painful. And through all of this, Zeus watched from Olympus, sometimes intervening, sometimes remaining distant, always aware of his children but not always able, or willing, to shield them from the consequences of their divine heritage. He had given them great gifts, but he had also given them great burdens. In this, Zeus's relationship with his children reflected the Greek understanding of the gods. Themselves, powerful and capable of great generosity, but also capricious, limited by fate, and not always aligned with human notions of justice or mercy. Symbols, powers, and sacred sites of Zeus. To understand Zeus fully, we must also understand the symbols and powers associated with him, for these were not merely attributes but expressions of his fundamental nature. The thunderbolt was his most famous weapon, the symbol that identified him instantly to any who saw it. These were not simple lightning strikes, but weapons crafted by the Cyclopes, jagged spears of pure electrical force that Zeus could hurl with devastating accuracy. When Zeus was angry, the sky would darken with storm clouds, and his thunderbolts would split the heavens, each strike a visible manifestation of his wrath and his power. The symbolism of the thunderbolt was profound. Lightning was the most dramatic natural phenomenon the ancient Greeks witnessed, a force that could strike without warning, that could kill in an instant, that came from the sky itself. By wielding this force, Zeus demonstrated his mastery over the most powerful and unpredictable aspects of nature. The thunderbolt represented divine judgment, sudden and inescapable, the punishment that came from the heavens for those who violated divine law or offended the gods. But Zeus's power over the sky extended beyond just lightning and thunder. He commanded the rain that nurtured crops and filled rivers, making him essential to agricultural prosperity. He controlled the winds that filled the sails of ships and brought changing weather. The ancient Greeks understood that their survival depended on the whims of weather, and Zeus, as master of the sky, held their prosperity in his hands. This made him not just a warrior god or a king, but a deity whose favor was essential for daily life. The eagle was Zeus's sacred bird, a creature that soared higher than any other, that could look directly at the sun without flinching, that combined grace with deadly predatory power. Eagles served as Zeus's messengers and as his symbols, appearing in the sky as omens of his will. When an eagle appeared, particularly at significant moments, it was interpreted as a sign from Zeus himself, blessing or warning depending on the circumstances of its appearance. The eagle represented Zeus's far-seeing vision, his ability to survey all that happened in the world below and to strike swiftly when necessary. The oak tree was also sacred to Zeus, particularly the great oak of Dodona, one of his most ancient oracle sites. The rustling of the oak's leaves was interpreted by priestesses as messages from the god himself. This connection between Zeus and the oak tree linked him to the earth and to the ancient past, suggesting that his power was not only in the sky but rooted in the deep places of the world. The oak was strong and enduring, capable of surviving storms and living for centuries, qualities that reflected Zeus's own nature as the stable center of the cosmic order. The aegis, a shield or breastplate often depicted as a goat's skin adorned with tassels and bearing the head of the Gorgon Medusa, was another of Zeus's symbols. He sometimes lent this powerful protective device to his daughter Athena, showing his trust in her and his willingness to share his power with those who served his purposes. When Zeus shook the aegis, it produced storms and struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. The Gorgon head on the aegis turned those who looked upon it to stone, making it not just a defensive weapon but an offensive one as well. The bull, particularly in its association with his seduction of Europa, became another of Zeus's symbols. The bull represented raw strength and fertility, qualities that Zeus possessed in abundance. In some regions, Zeus was worshipped in bull form or was depicted with bull-like features, emphasizing his power and his role as a progenitor of heroes and demigods. Zeus's powers extended far beyond his famous control over weather and lightning. As king of the gods, he possessed the authority to enforce divine law and to punish those who violated it. His word was binding even on other gods, though they might sometimes seek to circumvent his decrees through trickery or persuasion. He could see all that happened in the world, though his attention was not infinite, and clever mortals or gods could sometimes hide their actions from his gaze. Zeus had the power to bestow immortality, as he did with Heracles, or to grant other exceptional boons to those who pleased him. He could transform himself and others into different shapes, a power he used extensively in his romantic pursuits, but also in more benevolent contexts, such as when he turned Io back into human form after her torment. He could speak prophecy, though he often chose to communicate his will through oracles rather than directly, and he had a kind of cosmic awareness that allowed him to sense when the natural order was being disrupted or when major events were unfolding that required his attention. The worship of Zeus was widespread throughout the ancient Greek world, with major cult sites established in multiple locations. Mount Olympus itself was considered his primary home, the place where he held court and gathered the gods for council. But mortals could not easily ascend Olympus, so they worshipped Zeus at more accessible locations. Olympia, in the western Peloponnese, was perhaps the most famous cult site of Zeus. Here stood one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the massive statue of Zeus created by the sculptor Phidias. This chryselephantine statue, made of gold and ivory over a wooden frame, depicted Zeus seated on an elaborate throne, holding a figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, in his right hand and a scepter topped with an eagle in his left. The statue was so large and so magnificent that ancient writers claimed it inspired religious awe in all who saw it. Olympia was also the site of the Olympic Games, held every 4 years in Zeus's honor. These games were not merely athletic competitions but religious festivals, times when all of Greece would declare a sacred truce and gather to honor the king of the gods through sport and sacrifice. Dodona, in northwestern Greece, housed the oldest oracle of Zeus. The priests and priestesses of Dodona interpreted the rustling of the sacred oak's leaves and the clanging of bronze vessels suspended in the tree to divine Zeus's will. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to ask questions of the oracle, seeking guidance on everything from personal matters to affairs of state. The oracle of Dodona predated even the more famous oracle of Apollo at Delphi, showing that Zeus's role as a prophetic deity was ancient and deeply rooted. On Mount Lycaon in Arcadia, Zeus was worshipped in an especially ancient and somewhat dark form as Zeus Lycaos, Zeus of the wolves. The cult practices here included rituals that may have been extremely old, possibly predating the Olympian religion as we know it. Ancient writers hinted at human sacrifice in the earliest periods of this cult, though by the classical era, such practices, if they had ever truly existed, had been replaced with more conventional offerings. In Athens, though Athena was the patron deity, Zeus was honored with several significant cults. The massive temple of Olympian Zeus, begun in the 6th century BCE but not completed until the 2nd century CE under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, stood as a testament to the god's importance even in a city dedicated to his daughter. Zeus was worshipped there as Zeus Olympios, emphasizing his role as king of the gods and ruler of the cosmos. In many cities, Zeus was honored as Zeus Pelus, guardian of the city, or Zeus Soter, Zeus the savior, protector in times of danger. Altars to Zeus stood in marketplaces and on hilltops, in private homes and public temples. Oaths were sworn in his name, for Zeus was the guarantor of oaths and the punisher of those who broke them. Treaties between cities were placed under his protection. Kings and rulers claimed to derive their authority from him, ruling not by their own power, but as Zeus's representatives on earth. The worship of Zeus involved various forms of sacrifice, with bulls being the most prestigious offering. The meat from these sacrifices would be divided, with portions burned for the gods, the smoke carrying the essence to Olympus, and the rest distributed among the worshippers in a communal feast. Wine libations were poured in his honor. Incense was burned at his altars. Hymns were sung praising his power and justice. These rituals reinforced the social bonds within communities, while also maintaining the relationship between mortals and the divine. Through his symbols and his cult sites, through the prayers and sacrifices offered in his name, Zeus remained a constant presence in the daily lives of the ancient Greeks. He was not a distant, abstract deity, but a real and active force in the world, one whose favor could bring prosperity and whose anger could bring destruction. The Greeks understood that they lived in a world where the gods were real and powerful, and Zeus, as king of those gods, demanded respect, fear, and honor in equal measure. Zeus as judge and lawgiver beyond his role as a warrior who had fought monsters and overthrown titans, beyond his role as a lover who had fathered countless children across the divine and mortal realms, Zeus held another crucial position in the cosmic order. He was the supreme judge and the enforcer of divine law. This aspect of his character is sometimes overlooked in popular retellings that focus on his more dramatic adventures and his notorious infidelities, but it was fundamental to how the ancient Greeks understood Zeus and his place in their world. Zeus was called Zeus Horkios, Zeus of the oath, because he was the divine power that guaranteed the sanctity of oaths and promises. In a world where written contracts were rare and legal systems were still developing, oaths sworn in Zeus's name were the foundation of trust between individuals, between cities, and between mortals and gods. To swear falsely by Zeus was not merely a social transgression, but a religious crime that would bring divine punishment. The Greeks believed that Zeus kept track of every oath sworn in his name and would eventually punish those who violated them, even if mortal authorities never discovered the deception. This role made Zeus essential to the functioning of Greek society. Merchants swore oaths to ensure fair dealing. Witnesses in legal proceedings swore oaths to tell the truth. Ambassadors and treaty makers swore oaths to bind their cities to their agreements. Hosts and guests swore oaths of friendship and protection. All of these oaths invoked Zeus as their guarantor, and all created obligations that Zeus would enforce. The concept of xenia, or guest friendship, was particularly sacred to Zeus. He was known as Zeus Xenios, Zeus the protector of guests and strangers. The Greeks believed that any stranger who came to their door might be Zeus in disguise, testing their hospitality. This belief encouraged generous treatment of travelers and foreigners, creating networks of mutual obligation that spanned the Greek world. To mistreat a guest or to abuse the hospitality offered to you as a guest was to offend Zeus directly, and the punishment for such offenses could be severe. Many myths illustrated this principle. When King Lycaon of Arcadia served Zeus human flesh to test whether he was truly divine, Zeus punished him by transforming him into a wolf, a fitting fate for one who had behaved like a beast. When the people of Phrygia refused hospitality to Zeus and Hermes, who were traveling in disguise, the gods flooded the entire region, sparing only the elderly couple Baucis and Philemon, who had welcomed the strangers into their humble home despite having little to offer. Zeus's concern with justice extended beyond personal interactions to the governance of cities and kingdoms. Kings and rulers were said to receive their authority from Zeus, and they were expected to rule justly in his name. A just king was favored by Zeus and would see his city prosper. An unjust king would face divine punishment, perhaps through natural disasters, military defeat, or political upheaval. The Greeks did not have a concept of separation between religious and secular authority. All political power was ultimately derived from divine sanction, and Zeus was the god who granted or withdrew that sanction. The Fates, who some traditions identified as daughters of Zeus and Themis, represented the cosmic order that even Zeus had to respect. But within the bounds of fate, Zeus had considerable discretion to reward justice and punish injustice. He watched over the affairs of mortals from his throne on Olympus, using his eagle to fly over the world and bring back reports of what was happening below. When he learned of crimes against divine law, particularly crimes of hubris, where mortals exceeded their proper station or showed disrespect to the gods, he would intervene to punish the offenders. Hubris was perhaps the greatest offense in Zeus's eyes. It represented a violation of the cosmic order, an attempt by mortals to claim powers or honors that belonged to the gods alone. Those who committed hubris, whether by boasting that they were superior to the gods, by attempting to avoid death, or by treating other humans with excessive cruelty, would inevitably face divine retribution. Zeus's punishment for hubris was often severe and creative, designed not just to end the offense, but to serve as a warning to others. King Tantalus, who stole ambrosia from the gods and served his own son as food to test the gods' omniscience, was punished with eternal torment in Tartarus. He stood in a pool of water that receded whenever he tried to drink, beneath branches heavy with fruit that withdrew whenever he reached for them, giving us the word tantalize. Sisyphus, who cheated death and showed contempt for the gods, was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down just before he reached the top. Ixion, who attempted to seduce Hera, was bound to a burning wheel that spun through the sky forever. These punishments were not merely vindictive. They served as examples, demonstrating to mortals the consequences of overreaching and reminding them of their place in the cosmic hierarchy. The Greeks believed in a natural order where gods were gods and mortals were mortals, where each being had their proper role and proper limits. Zeus, as king of the gods and enforcer of divine law, maintained that order, ensuring that boundaries were respected and that the cosmos remained stable. But Zeus's justice was not simple or always comprehensible to mortal minds. The same god who punished oath-breakers and protected guests was also guilty of infidelity and deception. The same god who demanded respect for divine law sometimes bent that law to suit his own desires. This apparent contradiction was part of what made Zeus such a complex figure in Greek mythology. He was not a god of absolute moral perfection, but rather a god of power who generally, though not always, used that power in service of a broader cosmic order. The Greeks seem to have understood this complexity. They did not expect their gods to be moral exemplars in the way that later monotheistic religions would expect of their deity. Instead, the gods were powerful beings who established the rules by which society functioned, even if they themselves sometimes operated outside those rules. Zeus's position as judge and lawgiver was based on his power and authority, not on his moral perfection. He could enforce justice because he was the king of the gods, and his word, whether just or unjust by mortal standards, was law. This understanding of Zeus as both lawgiver and sometimes lawbreaker, as both judge and occasional transgressor, reflects a sophisticated Greek worldview that recognized the complexity and contradictions inherent in power. Zeus represented order, but he also represented the exercise of power in ways that might seem arbitrary or self-serving. He demanded justice from others, while his own actions sometimes contradicted his proclaimed values. And yet, despite these contradictions, the cosmic order he presided over was understood to be better than the chaos that would result from his absence. In councils on Olympus, Zeus would hear disputes between gods and render judgments. In the mortal world, he would watch over the administration of justice, blessing righteous judges and punishing corrupt ones. Through his oracles, he would provide guidance to cities and individuals facing difficult decisions. And through the fear of his punishment, he encouraged people to behave justly, to honor their oaths, to treat guests with respect, and to acknowledge the limits of mortal power. Zeus's role as judge and lawgiver thus completed the picture of him as king. He was not merely a warrior who had won his throne through combat, though he was that. He was not merely a progenitor who had spread his bloodline throughout the cosmos, though he was that too. He was also the source of law and order, the guarantor of oaths and treaties, the protector of the weak against the strong, and the punisher of those who violated the sacred principles that held society together. In this role, he was perhaps most essential to the ancient Greeks, for without the justice that Zeus represented and enforced, civilization itself would have been impossible. The enduring legacy of Zeus, as we near the end of our journey through the mythic life of Zeus, it is worth reflecting on what this god represented to the ancient Greeks and what his stories can still tell us today. Zeus was many things: warrior and lover, father and king, judge and transgressor. His stories are filled with contradictions that would seem jarring if we expected them to form a coherent moral narrative. But Greek mythology was never meant to provide simple moral lessons. Instead, it reflected the complexity of existence itself, the way that power and justice, love and cruelty, order and chaos could coexist in the same being. Zeus's journey from hidden infant to king of the gods embodied the Greek understanding of how power was won and maintained. He did not inherit the throne peacefully, but had to fight for it, first against his father and the Titans, then against Typhon, then against the giants. Each victory reinforced his claim to rule, but each also revealed the fragility of that rule, the constant threats that lurked and the eternal vigilance required to maintain order. His relationships with other gods showed the complexity of governance. Zeus was the king, but he ruled alongside his brothers who had their own domains, alongside his sisters and children who had their own powers and wills. He had to negotiate, persuade, and sometimes coerce to get his way. The divine family of Olympus was not a harmonious paradise, but a place of competing interests and occasional conflict, much like any human family or political system. Zeus's ability to maintain order among such diverse and powerful personalities was perhaps his greatest achievement. His love affairs, for all their problematic aspects, demonstrated Zeus's connection to the entire cosmos. Through his many lovers and his many children, Zeus bound together the divine and mortal realms. His bloodline flowed through heroes and kings, giving them divine legitimacy but also divine burdens. The heroes born of Zeus's affairs became the protagonists of some of Greece's greatest stories, facing challenges and achieving feats that pure mortals could not. Through them, Zeus's influence touched every corner of the Greek world and beyond. His role as judge and lawgiver showed the ancient Greek understanding that power must be connected to justice if it is to be legitimate. Zeus was not just the strongest god, but the one who enforced the rules that made civilization possible. Oaths, hospitality, respect for boundaries. These were the principles Zeus upheld, and they were the principles that allowed Greek society to function. That Zeus himself sometimes violated these principles created a tension in the mythology, but it was a tension the Greeks seemed comfortable with, recognizing that power always exceeds perfect justice. The worship of Zeus was central to ancient Greek religious life for over 1,000 years. From the Mycenaean period through the Classical Age and into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Zeus remained the supreme deity, the king of the gods whose favor was sought and whose anger was feared. His festivals brought communities together. His oracles guided important decisions. His temples were architectural marvels that demonstrated human devotion and skill. Even as Greek religion evolved and adapted to changing circumstances, Zeus remained at the center, a stable point around which everything else revolved. When we look at Zeus today, from our vastly different cultural perspective, we might be troubled by aspects of his mythology. His treatment of his lovers raises serious questions about consent and the abuse of power. His relationship with Hera, marked by infidelity and often bitter conflict, seems far from the ideal marriage that Hera herself was supposed to represent. His willingness to punish innocents, particularly the children born from his affairs, for crimes they did not commit seems unjust by modern standards. But these troubling aspects were not hidden or glossed over by the ancient Greeks. They were part of the stories, openly told and widely known. The Greeks were not blind to the problematic nature of Zeus's behavior. Rather, they seem to have understood that power, even divine power, could be exercised in ways that caused harm, and that the beings who wielded such power were not simple moral exemplars, but complex entities with their own desires and limitations. Zeus's mythology, for all its specific cultural context, touches on themes that remain relevant: the relationship between power and justice, the tension between personal desire and social responsibility, the ways that families can be both sources of strength and sites of conflict, the difficulty of maintaining order in a world of diverse interests and competing values. These are not ancient questions, but eternal ones, and Zeus's stories offer one way of thinking about them. In the end, Zeus represents the Greek attempt to understand the forces that govern their world, the weather that could nourish or destroy their crops, the social bonds that held their cities together, the hierarchies of power that structured their political life, the mysteries of fate and destiny. All of these were embodied in Zeus and in the stories told about him. He was a god who contained multitudes, who could be generous and cruel, just and arbitrary, loving and distant. He was, in short, a reflection of the world as the Greeks experienced it: powerful, complex, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, but always demanding respect and attention. The thunder still rolls across the sky, though we now understand it as the result of atmospheric conditions rather than divine anger. The eagles still soar above the mountains, though we see them as magnificent birds rather than messengers of the gods. The oak trees still rustle in the wind, though we no longer interpret their movement as prophecy. But the stories of Zeus remain, passed down through millennia, still capable of stirring something in us, still offering insights into the human condition and the eternal questions of power, justice, love, and fate. Zeus, the hidden child of Crete, the rebel who overthrew his father, the warrior who defeated monsters, the lover who seduced mortals and gods alike, the father of countless children, the king of Olympus, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the judge and lawgiver. His mythic life was vast and complex, touching every aspect of existence. In exploring his stories, we explore the Greek understanding of divinity, power, and the cosmos itself. And perhaps, in these ancient tales, we find echoes of truths that remain relevant even in our very different world, reminders of the complexity of power, the importance of justice, and the enduring human struggle to find meaning and order in a universe that often seems chaotic and indifferent. The king of the gods has ruled for thousands of years in the realm of story and imagination. His throne on Olympus may be a myth, but the questions his stories raise, and the insights they offer, continue to resonate. Zeus's mythic life is, in the end, a mirror held up to our own existence, reflecting back the grandeur and the flaws, the power and the vulnerability that define not just gods but all beings who seek to create order from chaos, justice from power, and meaning from the raw material of existence. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the complete mythic life of Zeus, king of Olympus. From his hidden birth in a cave on Crete to his establishment as the supreme ruler of gods and mortals, from his battles against titans and monsters to his complex relationships with lovers and children, from his role as warrior and king to his position as judge and lawgiver, we have explored the many facets of this complex and powerful deity. Zeus's story is, in many ways, the story of ancient Greek civilization itself, its values and contradictions, its understanding of power and justice, its view of the relationship between mortals and the divine. The thunder god who ruled from Olympus was more than just a religious figure. He was a lens through which the Greeks understood their world and their place within it. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of Zeus and his mythic life, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Slumber Scrolls. We have many more journeys through history and mythology planned, each one designed to help you drift peacefully into sleep while learning something new about the fascinating stories that have shaped human culture. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as vast as the sky that Zeus commanded. Until next time.